Here she is. So Naomi Fox and I worked together at Philips back in 2001, 2002. As you can see, I've got a bit fatter and older at the time.
I understand the vibe.
You are still gorgeous. So I was putting together, I went looking for people that could talk on change and change management. And I reckon anyone that tried to bring change into a firm succeed to a certain point gets my vote. God knows they are a fun group to work with. So Naomi has now started her own business called Culture Co Lab after 20 years in a corporate career, and I, for one, can say she is to work with. So today you're talking about change and perhaps a different approach to change, and certainly as HR and TR functions, that's all we seem to be doing at the moment.
Yes.
You know, it's a pretty common thing that most of our projects, to a certain extent, fail, and a lot of that is around the change. I know that because I went to implement TS in another law firm which failed spectacularly, and it was all about how to manage the change management with group of people. So I am going to hand over to you. If you've got slides, you should have a button to share. So if you do that, and folks, questions in the comments, and I will ask in the chat group, and I'll ask anything at the end. If you've got time, hang around, stay on the table for a chat at some point.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
So much, Andrea. Can you hear me? So everybody, I truly understand what Andrea is talking about, and particularly with your roles in HR, which of course I've been a part of many HR functions, and also particularly from that talent acquisition perspective, not only for your own roles, but the kind of talent you're recruiting is such an important role that you have in terms of thinking about how you can more successfully drive change. And so today's session is really around, you know, have you ever wondered why your beautiful designed and delivered change intervention, just like the one that no doubt Andrea tried to implement with her law firm, just didn't get that traction that you're hoping for? Are you working with agile methods? A number of organizations are implementing those, or even design thinking, which has certainly sort of taken the organizations by storm, and certainly in HR. And are you wondering about their impact? So our session today will help you, I hope, make sense of these questions by helping you extend your repertoire of change, growth, and transformational approaches, and avoid the pitfalls of that top-down driven change, because we're going to be thinking a bit differently about change and transformation by shifting from diagnostic to dialogic approaches. And I am well aware of the pitfalls of top-down driven change. I'm an organisational development professional with experience and expertise in aligning and shaping organisational design and culture. I've held senior roles in consulting as well as in-house. My more recent role, which does feel like a little while ago now, was as a global role, head of culture and customer and employee experience at Telstra, one of Australia's largest telco. And that really has helped me with my clients in looking at problems and opportunities and challenges from different angles, both from that in-house and that external perspective. And today, as Andrea said, I am the founder and principal of Culture Co Lab, an organisation that helps clients create clarity, shape culture, and elevate capacity. I also happen to be the chair of a board for a not-for-profit called Ready Set. And so the kind of chaos that we've all been thrown into with COVID is something that I have felt firsthand with having to recruit a new CEO and just try and, you know, make sure that there's enough revenue coming in and we're engaging our volunteers. It's full of complexity and the pace and the challenge, and the pace is just ever increasing. And in fact, the speed of change is rapidly increasing over the course of these industrial revolutions, which I'm sure you've all seen some kind of a slide like this. In fact, the first, second and third revolutions really took place about 100 years apart, and it's now much more rapid as we hit the fourth industrial revolution. The speed of change has increased dramatically, and along with it, complexity, which is arguably doubled. The fourth industrial revolution involves digitization, automation, and enabling the Internet of Things, big data and machine learning. I know you all are aware of that. And a fellow board member and HR director for Oricon has shared with me that it seems as though technology and commerce have eclipsed humanism. And in fact, as you can see from across each of those industrial revolutions, there is a sense of dehumanizing by the momentum of technology and commerce. So the industrial revolution is where humanism, civility, inclusivity, creativity, and purpose will thrive alongside profit and digitally enabled progress. Well, we certainly hope that that's the case. And we are seeing the beginnings of this, this experience of this fifth industrial revolution. Things like promoting STEAM instead of STEM, putting the A back into those critical learning, not just science, not just technology, not just maths and engineering, but also the arts and the humanities. We're seeing it even in the HR field around shifting from employee engagement to more of that employee experience and using the toolkit of design thinking and human-centered design. So this building towards a more series of conscious choices where a different model of organisation exists, a different model of profitability, a place where profits, purpose and people can thrive together and foster a community of action is a real opportunity for us as an HR community. And the opportunity of the fifth industrial revolution is firstly asking the question, how can you make the world better rather than just more efficient or more productive? Or how can you improve the organisation, the teams and the leaders that you work with rather than just make them more efficient or more productive? And working in parallel with the fourth industrial revolution by defining the ethics and the impact of the technology developed in that fourth industrial revolution. And I'd like to think that we're actually putting the human back. We're rehumanizing work. Finally, the success of change and transformation in this time of rapid speed of change is confounded by VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguity. And COVID has made VUCA now. I talk about it as VUCA now, but a client of mine with her executive team talks about it as VUCA++. And as that rate of disruption increases and the problems to solve become more complex, algorithms are no longer the sole answer. No matter how sophisticated our technologies become, we need increased human curiosity and creativity to meet the challenges of this complex world that we work in. And yet we know from that change and transformation efforts are not successful. Large global consulting firms have done plenty of surveys and many of them come up with a very similar kind of response that actually only 25, that's generous, 25% of successful transformations take place, which leaves us 75%, that's 3/4 of them are actually not successful. And part of the reason why I think they're not successful, and you'll certainly see it in the literature, is that it's due to an overemphasis by leaders on big vision change, top-down driven change and processes, and tell-sell communication, the big town halls. So despite the context of disruption and change, we are challenged to define, with leaders who define change and delegate the implementation, or define the problem and the solution. So what is the opportunity for us as a community of HR, talent, and organizational development practitioners? How do we contribute to continuing to perpetuate top-down change? And how can we enable change that recognizes our context of complexity, that connects people, purpose, and profit? I think HR and OD can influence this by shifting from diagnostic to a more dialogic practice. And I'll talk about that over the course of the next little while. We need to think again. And I want to borrow that idea from Adam Grant's latest book, released at the beginning of the year, called Think Again. He talks about, in a rapidly changing world, we need other cognitive skills apart from our intelligence. We need the ability to rethink and relearn, as our ideas about how the world works needs to remain fluid as new information is acquired and as the context changes. And we need to do this, as most leaders tend to underestimate the complex nature of the problem and apply a complicated and ordered or planned approach to solving the problem, the change. And they seek out experts to help diagnose the problem, recommend how to solve it, and implement a solution. And while this planned approach is valuable and can be effective if the problem is indeed a complicated one, more often than not, they find that once the solution has been implemented, the problem recurs or presents itself elsewhere as another version of itself. And I must say, I have a few too many stories from my own past in actually seeing a problem, thinking I can solve it, deploying it, getting great reviews, great success, and then actually, lo and behold, it pops up slightly differently, but somewhere else. And that's because people are involved, let's face it. It's more likely that the problem is not so much complicated as complex. The nature of the problem could have had many perspectives, and how the whole system interacts with it will determine at any point in time how the issue presents itself. And this really means it's much more of an adaptive challenge requiring an adaptive approach. And we need to think again with fresh mindsets, processes, methods, and roles to thrive with complexity. I draw on some of the work in Heifetz. You might be familiar with adaptive and technical leadership. I love some of the work of Jennifer Garvey-Berger around changing on the job and simple habits for complex times, and her more recent book, Unlocking Leadership Mind Traps. It was my Christmas read. And of course, Dave Snowden's Kinevin model on decision making. Jervis Bush and Bob Marshak's work has really gone on to apply these ideas to organisational development and how we as HR professionals and organisational development professionals drive improvement and behaviour change. They identify behavioural change as technical or generative, or planned and generative, through a diagnostic and a dialogic organisational development methods. These, I think, the dialogic approaches, are the fresh ways for us to understand how to drive change, and they inform the work that I do with my clients. And I'd like to share these ideas with you and the approaches with some examples of how, and to hopefully help you to be able to think again. So firstly, the planned technical approach. Somewhat like having 20/20 vision, planned change adopts a diagnostic approach. It starts with engagement with leaders on defining real organisational problems using diagnostic and data-based methods, both qualitative and quantitative, to assess the factors contributing to the problem and evaluate in order to propose beautiful solutions that would typically re-educate, increase awareness, and engage members to change. Some of my great wins and successes in my career actually have come from doing some brilliant work around re-educating people to think differently and to increase their awareness around the change that they can bring. It does assume a more top-down approach with experts to help diagnose that problem, recommend how to solve it, and implement the solution. And this planned approach is valuable and can be effective if the problem is indeed a complicated one, as it has cause-effect relationship that is uncovered during the diagnosis, where good practices, perhaps rather than best practices, are applied, such as things like benchmarking. But the problem is when the variables for cause and effect keep shifting. There is inevitable stress for people like me as HR, and no doubt people like yourselves, HR and OD professionals, when the promised results aren't realised, and the frustration of line and executive leaders who put their own reputations and credibility on the line to support and help sponsor these initiatives, see that they fail. Over time, and with different attempts to resolve the problem to varying degrees of success, this frustration and stress can turn into skepticism about the ability for HR and OD teams to deliver value to the organisation. And this undermines the team's role with their colleagues and ultimately with the people and the leaders in the organisation. It's a real lose-lose situation. So let's contrast this with the dialogic OD approach. Generative change draws on dialogic approaches that are adaptive in their context. In this case, cause and effect is only perceptible in retrospect. Transformational change is more emergent than planned. It's viewed as a dialogic system where individuals, groups, and the organisation actions result from socially constructed realities, sustained by the prevailing narratives, the stories, the metaphors, the conversations through which people make meaning of their experiences. And these approaches embrace conversations and emergence, continuous and iterative change, probes and experiments, holding safe containers. It starts with a clear purpose, a possibility-focused statement. The purpose could be, we want to improve customer satisfaction, or we want to increase profitability, or a very pertinent one for Australia at the moment is, we want to improve aged care. And in Dialogic OD, the change process results from changing conversations, those that shape everyday thinking and behaviour. And it's about involving more and different voices. It results from altering how and which people engage with each other. And it stimulates alternative images to shape how people think about things. So instead of change driven by diagnosing how to objectively align or realign organisational elements like strategies, structures, processes, technologies, people practices, with the demands of the broader environment as suggested by open systems, the dialogic perspective invites consideration how to induce new ways of thinking by altering the ongoing organisational conversations that continuously create, recreate, and frame people's understanding and ultimately their action. So what do these two approaches look like when you think about them from a process perspective? So you'd be pretty familiar with this model, I have no doubt. A planned change model starts with defining the problem, collecting and analysing the data, creating a vision of what success or the change might look like, planning and implementing that solution, creating action teams or learning groups, and monitoring and evaluating the progress. The challenge with this, though, is that successful change actually takes leaders leading the process and stakeholders defining the changes. In fact, we know that 90% success is when probes and pilots are used, is when when change can be more successful. So when leaders define the change and staff lead the process, it's very unlikely to be successful. Stakeholder defining the changes with staff leading the process, it's conditional on the leader's buy-in. But actually you'll get much more success by thinking about engaging people, getting leaders to lead those change processes, and using probes. And that's why I think that the Dialogic OD approach and the process can really help us think differently about how we can be successful with change. In this approach, where instead we're identifying the adaptive challenge, we're reframing that into a possibility-focused purpose statement. And that statement should be something that really engages the stakeholders, really motivates them. It's so much more so that they're willing to crawl over glass to be engaged in this conversation because it matters to them. And then engaging diverse stakeholders in generative conversations through running workshops and a range of different ways of doing that. There's lots of different methods in this approach. Stimulating self-organized innovative probes. So what's a probe? So it's like, think of it like a pilot, or the Cynefin frame would talk about it as a fail-safe experiment. And then learning from successes and failures, and scaling up and embedding successful probes. And so when there is a common purpose, there is more likely for self-organising to support the collective good. I worked, for example, I worked with a local council on their customer experience strategy, and we adopted a generative change model as the approach, starting with the aspiration and then working with a collective of employees to identify pilots and opportunities for improving customer experience. The hiccup, though, that we faced was in the workshop when we're identifying those probes. Not enough leaders were brought into the customer experiences and the desired customer experience and their pain points, and they struggled to actually accept the aspiration. And so the key learning for us for the project group was in the lack of the leaders in the conversations that shaped the aspiration. Customers were, employees were, executives were, but not enough of the leaders and the managers. And in fact, that is such a critical part, and we'll talk a little bit later about the role of leaders in the Dialogic OD approach. So probes and pilots, I just want to dig into those because they are so powerful. We think about them like shooting fire bullets rather than cannonballs. So this is really about small, successful experiments followed by bigger bets that exploit what you learn. You try to launch as many experiments as possible and learn as you go. So in generative change, leaders don't pick the solutions. They don't really even pick the experiments. The idea of the self-organizing teams are the ones that are kind of working with the purpose to actually test things out in their own on-the-ground working lives. The stakeholders need to believe that they will not be held accountable to be successful, because this is just to test and learn and see what is actually possible, and only that they try and that everyone learns from their pilot project. Tracking, fanning, and amplifying successful experiments to lead transformational change is a key part of the leader role. And the idea that you might both work out where the successful ones are, but also dampen the ones that aren't getting the traction or aren't leading to helping resolve the challenge, is also part of the role. A good example of probes and pilots working quite well is as part of a large enterprise transformation program to new ways of working. And it was clear that the technology, the structure, the processes and the roles were well managed and underway. But the problem was the piece of the transformation agenda was engaging people with the why and the purpose of the change so that they would ultimately embody the change. It was identified that a process was needed to take people on the journey so that they could seed back into the business what the creation of probes and feedback loops would be to help them understand what change would look like and inform and then test and the design and test. So they identified key stakeholders and advocates. They brought people together to develop a shared understanding of the purpose. They interrogated it, they pulled it apart and built stories around it. They're engaged in conducting what they called mini missions, small experiments, just like we've been talking about, where they were really testing out the possible future team structure and how it might work. So they engaged with this at the local level. They explored different perspectives and tested it. They also tested language and the appetite for change, which actually varied across teams. And that really allowed them to understand more about how the change was going to land with people and ways in which, in engaging the people and actually thinking about how they could make the change happen for themselves at the local level. Feedback was shared and synthesized into quick actions and keys for the broader transformation agenda. And the cohort was engaged to reflect on the process, to share further insights, make meaning, and combine both different types of learning around both actions, but also learning around changing their own assumptions about the project. In this case, the key role of the leaders was really important. They really felt that they built confidence by using these probes and experiments. They were seen as lower risk rather than the big bang, the top-down approach, the town hall, the script. It was much more that they were able to draw on experience of change from the ground, from the people expected to change, through the process, this process of probes and pilots, sensing, testing, and working out what resonates. So the leader role is really critically important. Here, what we're really looking for is helping leaders. It's not critically important, it's different. And I think that's really, really, really important to think about. What is it that you're doing in your role as an HR professional or even as a talent acquisition role? How are you identifying the people who are able to do this, or how are you supporting leaders to be able to take on this role? What we need them to do is to name the purpose rather than provide a vision to motivate stakeholders. They need to get a hold of what the challenge is, and they need to be able to really articulate that possibility, purposeful statement like improving aged care for all Australians or something like that. Their role is around its attention. It's about it's different to the diagnostic approach, which is about setting the vision, the mandate, and walking away. Theirs is to sustain attention, to amplify the momentum. To realise that any solution to a problem will create a new problem and therefore the opportunity to increase adaptive capacity as it solves the problem. The search and the fact that the search for any answer that stakeholders will implement and move forward rather than searching for the answer. So any answer versus the answer. There might be lots of answers. There will be, in fact. Creating access, allocating resources, supporting those teams who are working through those probes, and establishing the clear boundaries of what's possible. Stimulating emergence of adaptive actions by providing opportunities to strengthen relationships and communications. One of the things of this approach is that it's very much about a broad range of stakeholders engaged in having conversations about this change. The beautiful thing that you can do as a leader is that you get to strengthen those relationships across silos, across locations, across sort of formal boundaries of the organisation. The role is to encourage self-initiated action, disseminate learning, celebrate successes and failures, amplify the successes, and ultimately dampen the things that don't really work, but learn from them. And understand that organisational change is a never-ending number of small wins. Such a different approach to a more planned approach. So what does that mean for your role? Holding, noticing, inquiring, and naming. I think that's kind of a summary of the things that I think that we can do in HR and OD to really kind of support leaders and support the organisation. So in that case, what we're doing is addressing the frame, not the content. Staying humble and curious. Realising it's their metaphor, their story, and their meaning, not yours, not one to synthesise, not one to extract and roll up. Listen for their logic, work with sensitivity, particularly around different cultural sensitivities, diversity and inclusion, as well as ask, and I love this, what do you mean by that? And all of that and all of your ability to do those things really sort of relies on you being really clear about what's your story. So what's your own level of self-awareness as you step into having conversations about change, about complexity? So what's your story? There's some beautiful mind traps that Jennifer Garvey-Berger has identified for leaders, and I think these apply beautifully for us as an HR community. So being trapped by simple stories, you know, that sometimes they blind you to really what's going on. And I see it all the time, the pragmatism of the community, simply just getting something done, sometimes blinds you to what's really going on. So one of the things you can do to counteract that is to think about carrying multiple stories about that situation, about the change, about that leader, about those individuals, about that team. What are some of the possibilities that might be going on that allows you to test them and allows you to really uncover what's going on? Being trapped by rightness, because if it feels right doesn't necessarily mean it is right. And we know all of that through understanding our own biases and limitations. And it's so easy just to kind of go to the thing that we feel so compelled by. Perhaps instead, though, we can listen to learn rather than listening to fix or win. Trapped by agreement. So looking for agreement can rob you of good ideas. It's definitely perhaps my Achilles heel. My desire to collaborate and come up with something where we all agree is just sometimes just overwhelmingly too much. So what I need to do and what I encourage you guys to do is to disagree and expand the ideas rather than agreeing to contract it first. Of course, there's a role for that. But first of all, let's expand the ideas. Put on that black hat. Find another way of thinking about that particular issue. Being trapped by control, which really strips you of your ability to influence. So experiment at the edges of letting go of the control. And being trapped by ego, so shackled by your ego to who you are now and who you think you are and who you stand for and what you think you're great at, because you can't reach for you what will be next. And that's really important in this work because it allows you to open up to being able to relearn. So listen to learn from yourself is the suggestion there. Okay, so this session has been about reframing our impact as HR and OD professionals and to stop solving adaptive challenges with technical solutions So we shift from fixing problems to cultivating a system capable of addressing its own challenges. The promise of solving a problem permanently is ultimately elusive. It is really only ameliorated. And so learning how to learn enables people to continually adapt as new issues arise. As the world becomes more complex, the Dialogic OD approach has that potential to leave behind a more evolved system with a greater sense of direction, hope, personal connection, and the will and energy to work across what we might have thought was previously unbridgeable boundaries. So one's destination is never a place, but rather a new way of looking at things. And I want to thank you, Andrea, for the opportunity to share what I think is some of the most important shifts that we can make in organisational development and as HR as a community to really be able to thrive with complexity and help our leaders and organisations do so too.
I agree completely. And actually, they're having a team day on Tuesday to sort of look at what the next 6 months looks like, because it's certainly still a very challenging time for us in this event world. And I'm actually going to take some of what you've been saying there, because I just moved too fast. My team are telling me I need to slow down and think a bit more. Thank you so much for what you have presented today. And look, we really must catch up for a coffee sometime.